Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the SOM TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. On today's episode, I'm going to be speaking with Paul Draper, one of the most legendary winemakers in probably the history of California winemaking. He is famous for putting Ridge Vineyards on the map with his team and for making Montebello one of the most famous vineyards in all of the United States. We're going to open up on today's podcast the 1971 Ridge Montebello that was part of the Judgment of Paris. The Judgment of Paris just had its anniversary, and to celebrate, SOM TV has an entire collection of Judgment of Paris material, including Steven Spurrier watching and commenting on the film Bottle Shock, which he had never done before, and many other bottles that are open. And you can also watch this opening on SOM TV right now, so subscribe at somtv.com. Without further ado, Paul Draper of Ridge Vineyards. Paul, anytime I get a chance to be at Ridge Vineyards, it's always a good day. But this is a particularly special day. You have in front of you a bottle I don't know how we convinced you to open, but why don't you tell me about this bottle and what this bottle is? Why is it famous?
So the 71 Montebello became far more famous than we had initially expected. We were kidding this morning that we haven't opened a bottle of it this year, so we can sacrifice a bottle. What it was that Steven Spurrier, English wine writer, had a small retail shop in Paris, the Madeleine. He also had connected with it a little tasting school for mainly American expats, or not really expats, but Americans working in Paris, and Brits, some Brits working in Paris, who wanted to learn more about wine. And he decided, as the bicentennial of the American Revolution came around in 76, that he would do a celebration with California wines for his group. And he decided that he could get a bunch of top French tasters, winemakers, principally journalists, sommelier, so on. He could get these guys and women to come to the Madeleine and taste California wines as part of this celebration. He came to us back in 69, 70. You've got to understand that in that day and age, there were about 4, maybe 5 California wineries, small California wineries, that were attempting to make really fine Cabernet. Everybody knew who they were, or everybody that was interested knew who they were. And, 3 or 4 were from Napa, and Ridge was down here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And that was it. I mean, nobody else in California, one exception, BV, was making some wonderful wines under Chelyshev, but they were a much bigger operation. And what Steven wanted to do was to focus on the small guys that were just really coming up. And so that was the group that he chose. He knew what wines he was going to get, when he came to California. He came to visit us, tasted the wines, explained that he had this celebratory tasting of California Cabernets coming up. The next year, he went home. The next year, Patricia Gallagher, his assistant, came and picked up the wines. For me, when I was here, when he was here in 70, and we talked, I was expecting that we would put in the 1970, which was this more structured, bigger wine than the 71. But Patricia came back. I wasn't here. She picked up the current release, which was the 71. And afterwards, I said, oh my God, that's really too bad. The 70 would have stood up to, to the others, even better. Anyway, they took them back. Steven at this point said, if I have all these French tasters and I present them with these California wines, being good Frenchmen, they're going to sit there and take those glasses and say, interesting, which is intéressant, which is damning. They're going to say, not bad, pas mal, which is damning, because they will simply be dismissing all these California wines. He said, on the other hand, if I bring in, both in the white wine run, white wine tasting, but particularly in the Bordeaux tasting of red wines, if I bring in top Bordeaux chateaus from the first growth, second growth, so on, and I have them with the California wines, blind, then these guys are going to have to take it seriously, and we're going to really get some interesting comments. And none of us knew this. The most we knew was that there was this celebration of the bicentennial with California wine. We knew nothing about his change of mind, the fact that he was going to include Bordeaux and that it was going to become competitive. When it was all over, that was a total surprise for everybody on this end. In any case, the 71 is what they took back.
Paul, what was the actual vintage like in 71 when you made this wine? What was it like?
It was a cool year, very elegant. Speaking of, where the wines are now at 15%, even more, the Cabernets in California, not ours, but in general. This wine is 12.2 alcohol, and typical, we were making the wines principally in 12.5, 12.8, 13. This was a cooler year, so 12.2. They took this back and had the judgment of Paris. And I felt sorry for the tasters because here in California, we have, of course, been tasting Bordeaux's forever and our own wines. And these guys, if any of them have had a good California wine before that tasting, I would be surprised. So here they were with these 10 wines in front of them and never having tasted a California wine of that quality before, and with a guy, a stringer from Time magazine, walking around behind them, listening to their comments and taking notes. As I said, I would have felt sorry for them.
How did the actual tasting play out, though? And why don't you go through kind of all the players that were involved from California and kind of where they were at in their journey as well for California wine?
What happened was the California wines, the known names in Napa were Joe Heights, Freemark Abbey, and Spring Mountain. And then, of course, as I say, from down here, Ridge. And then Stephen brought in the very first vintage of Stag's Leap, which was the 73. And for us, for example, we had been making Montebello since 62. So we had this history, and our wines, or at least were, in my case, 2 years older. I think the Heights was a 70. In any case, they were still quite young wines. The Ridge came in fifth. It came in, I think, ahead of one of the first growths, but right in the middle of the 10 wine tasting. The French, of course, when the results came out, in this country, it became not only for them, but very controversial about, was this fair? Did these guys know what they were tasting? On and on. Really, can we trust these results? Because the article in Time magazine laid out this great fact that California had done so well. And the comment from France was all very well, but in 30 years, we'll see where these California wines are, and we know these mainly 1970 Bordeaux's are going to be showing beautifully. And so that was sort of the way the whole thing went. There was, a lot of, you might say, good publicity. There was a lot of criticism. We've got as we said this morning, we haven't opened this year. It's a delight to be able to open it.
So the bottle in front of you, the 1971 Montebello, how rare is this bottle in actuality?
Oh, we're down to, I don't know, something like half a case, maybe a little more. Well, we were lucky. We know we did this 30-year repeat, but the interesting thing was that in 2016 would have been the 40th anniversary. A collector from the Bay Area here who had literally who was buying from us in the late 60s, early 70s, gave us a call and said, because right then we had like 2 bottles left. And he said, I have some 71 Montebello. I'd love to come up and open a bottle for you guys. And I'd like to, if you would, I'd love to trade you for the rest of the bottles I have for younger Montebellos. And we said, God, be our guest. And so he came up I got Eric, I got Shun, I got our whole team to there for lunch, and we opened his 71. And in 2016, which would have been the 40th, the 71 was still on that plateau, had not faded a bit from the 30th repeat. And so we kiddingly said, God, we should have gotten Stephen to do a 40th repeat, which he wouldn't have been able to do, because everything else had started to fade. The rest of the wines in the 30 repeat, and the Montebello was just still going out there at 40 years from the original tasting.
So obviously, Paul, this is a tremendously big deal. I know it is for me, but for you, this represents the early part of your career. I'm sure, for your family, for everyone you worked with, this is a tremendous bottle. What does this mean to you personally to open up the 71 right now?
When I heard that Eric had suggested that we open the 71, at first I went, oh my God, we've got so few bottles. It can be such a waste for just a couple of people to open a bottle like this. Now, as I've explained to you, when we finish, I'm going to get the crew together so everybody gets to have a taste. But yes, it's, for me, very special. I haven't tasted it for a year. That's about, we even go further than that, in many years that we've never opened a bottle. So this is special to me. And I love to see how it's showing. We're at, in terms of the age of the wine, it's now 49 years old. So literally, we've got a 50-year-old wine, California Cabernet, and how is it showing? My hope is, and I should say expectation is, that it will show beautifully. But of course, you never know.
With a bottle of wine this old, is there going to be a lot of sediment? You're going to have to decant?
The wines were just brought up from the cellar, and they did not have time to stand up. And so just like anybody with a bottle of old wine, you can imagine you really have to let it stand for a few days, because if it's a fine wine and has not been cleaned up before bottling excessively, it's going to have thrown a sediment, especially in 50 years. And so here was this bottle on its neck. We have a situation where it's not going to be something we can decant. We're going to have to eliminate the sediment as we decant, which is certainly not the way that we normally would approach this. But it's hopefully going to work for us in any case. I'm using a special corkscrew called a Duran, which is great for very old corks. I didn't even, want to try it, although the 71, the corks were very good. And my hope would have been that you could take it out with a regular corkscrew with no problem. But to be safe, I wanted to really use this Duran. And the cork is, in fact, at 50 years, soaked all the way through. The other thing is the ullage is really pretty good. It's in the lower part of the neck, but it's still in the neck, which is, given that the cork was completely soaked, is marvelous to see. Normally, well, actually, I still will decant with some light, but you could say that it really doesn't make a great deal of difference because of the major sediment that we've got.
All right, so you've got it open. Describe to me, talk us through this. What does it smell like? And tell us what the wine's like.
Oh, the wine smells great, so we'll see. So with 50 years, when my French friends thought that in about 10 it would have faded, we'll see how the 71 is. Boy, that nose hasn't oxidized or materized. Still beautiful. It's gonna actually open up in the decanter because the seal was really good. Layered, full-bodied. There's still fruit there. It's just astounding. I should have said to Stephen, let's do that 40-year repeat because the wine is going to show so well. So I have no regrets that it was the 71 instead of the 70. 70 is still strong. It's going to go out a number of years more, but to my great surprise, here's this elegant, balanced, I guess that's the word I should stress. is that from the beginning, the 71 was so beautifully balanced that that gave it the chance to age the way it's aged. We really feel that as you go to bottle, that the wine, as young as it is, has come together to the degree that you can really see that balance, that it's not excessively tannic, that it really, the elements have begun to come together. You're going to have this chance of a wine that will age a long time. So 50-year-old Cabernet from California, the 71 is a great example.
All right, tell me about the history of Ridge. I know that Ridge Vineyards has a really, really long history that predates, the winery that exists now. Can you tell us about that?
1885, an Italian doctor who had come to San Francisco and in fact was the principal doctor to the Italian community. And at that era, the Italian immigration to Northern California was just beginning. He was from Lucca to the coast. He was from quite close to Carrara and south of Genoa, from a town actually called Materana, very close to a town called Montebello. He came to San Francisco, wanted to grow vines as a doctor. He wanted to make wine. And he looked around at various regions. The Santa Cruz Mountains was just starting to be developed. This area, which I think to his surprise, was called the Montebello District. And I'm sure that attracted him immediately, given that he had grown up within, 20 kilometers of this town called Montebello in Italy. Came up here, saw this land, and said, this looks to me, and you've got to realize this is rocky soil, this is a limestone ridge, something that's very rare in California. The French, of course, feel limestone is an incredible element for fine wine. There's no limestone in Sonoma or in Napa. There's some to the south of us here, but really this is an unusual place to grow grapes. The limestone is exposed on the hilltops, so he was able to see what he was dealing with. And in 85, he arranged to buy the property, and in 86, he began to build this winery and to plant the vineyards around it. And he expanded the amount of land he had over the years. His first vintage, as far as we know, his first Montebello vintage was either 1891, 1892. And he continued to produce the winery did until 1920, when, of course, Prohibition brought a stop to everything.
So what happened after Prohibition?
His nephew carried it on, reopened it in 33, made the wine until his death in 36, only 3 years. The winery by that time closed and wasn't really reopened until 1959, 60, 61, 62. What occurred there was the three partners, scientists at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, had bought the property adjacent here, right below us. And we're here at 800 meters. We're up at 2,700 feet, something like that. And they had bought the adjoining property. It had Cabernet vines that had been replanted in the 40s, because all the Cabernet up here from pre-Prohibition had been let go. And we have pictures from the 30s and early 40s. There were still some remnant vineyards, but really by the 50s and 60s, there were no more of those original vines. The vines were replanted in 49, the Cabernet, and a little bit of Chardonnay. The Ridge partners made a half barrel in 59, but their friends said, you have to rebond this place and start making wine commercially here, because that 59 is so exceptional. You've got to realize in that day, the federal authorities, now TTB, then called the BATF, only were taking wineries out of business. That is, from that era, because of the Depression and the Second World War, there were more wineries still going out of business, and there were no new wineries starting. So the partners here at Ridge literally had to research and get the IRS, teach the IRS how to bond a winery in order to rebond us. But our first vintage then was 62 with an incredible vintage of Montebello in that year.
I mean, it's easy to think about Cabernet and such here now, but in this time, what grapes would they have planted? The original grapes here on the property.
Besides Cabernet, you've got to realize there was very little Cabernet in California. It wasn't even listed by the Department of Agriculture as a variety until 1936. The dominant grape until 1970 in Napa Valley was Petit Syrah. So you've got to realize that what we see today is just a whole different world from what was going on back when we started and back when, much of what we've talked about was going on. We assume he would have planted some Zinfandel, except that because there is some remnant 19th century Zinfandel at the bottom of this hill, the bottom of Montebello at about 1,300 feet. But it's so cool up here because of the elevation, and the Pacific is 16 miles directly west. And we can, from these vineyards right here, we can look out on a clear day in the winter when there's a breeze blowing, the wind blowing the marine haze off, and see the ships going by on the Pacific. So that altitude and that proximity to the Pacific meant that we have a very cool region, and that is not ideal for Zinfandel. So though there was some here, I cannot speculate if he would have planted any up here on the higher elevation vineyards.
So he's an Italian immigrant. Why would he plant Cabernet, a French grape?
That was the finest, even though there was so little of it, that was the finest varietal that was grown in California. And that just below us here, shortly after he was planting, a Alsatian restaurateur from San Francisco bought land just below us and built a winery and planted Cabernet, planted the Bordeaux varieties, more than, as far as I know, mainly Cabernet. And 5-6 years later, after Dr. Peroni began to produce Cabernet down there, and his Cabernet was called Miravalle. It's now our Klein Ranch. That was the name of the restaurateur. It's now our Klein Ranch, Montebello. He put into the Paris tasting of 1900 and won a gold medal for his Cabernet. So as little as there was, Cabernet was something that people on this mountain were looking at as far as what they could plant that would work in a cooler climate. You can say, from what we see today, with limestone soils, why didn't they plant Pinot Noir? Pinot Noir Burgundy was not as famous. Producers, as you know, a smaller region, very many fewer producers, tiny productions compared with Bordeaux. So Cabernet was, even in that day, was the best known of the fine wines.
Paul, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. This is an experience I will remember for the rest of my entire life. Until we open the next bottle of 71, I look forward to doing that. I want to remind everybody listening that you can watch Paul open the bottle right now in our Drink a Bottle series in the Judgment of Paris collection that's on Som TV. So on your apps or somtv.com, you can watch that. And please go there and subscribe. It's how we were able to make all this content and do this podcast. I want to thank Paul Draper, the whole staff at Ridge. I want to thank John Adams, our producer. And I want to thank you for listening. If you love this pod, please give us a great rating wherever you listen. And drink something nice. If you got some Montebello, some 50-year-old Montebello sitting by you, open that up right now. Now's the time. All right, everybody, be safe. Talk soon.